Ladies and gentlemen, this RickGamingTech.com video. We're going to start the first of a series of videos showing off various graphic techniques. Now, these are going to be 3D rendering, which are basically going to be going through all the various techniques that game artists use to show graphical effects in games and how to improve the rendering, such as textures and whatever else. Now, for many of the videos previously, you may have noticed that I've spoken a lot about programming efficiencies in games and how games developers need to act within certain constraints. Now, in this video, you can see that we're going to be doing something a little bit different from our typical gameplay video of me talking. We're actually going to be using visual aids, and I'm going to be showing you guys what occlusion is. Now, it's a pretty complicated subject to talk about without some visual aids, but we're going to be going over the basics in this. This video is not going to be going super in-depth. It's going to be showing you the very simple stuff and some very simple visual aids just to give you an idea of what it is. Now, before I start leaping around and showing you anything in these virtual worlds, I want you to be all on the same page with me. So when games developers are creating a title, whatever that title is, they need to look at the various hardware that it is, well, being created for. And then they need to decide a budget. In other words, a budget of how much detail they can cram in a specific scene with a target of frames per second. So in other words, the higher the frames per second they want, the less detail they can have. It's a pretty simple mathematical equation. In other words, the more rendering time is spent on pretty scenes, so better textures, better polygonal details and so on, the more expensive that all becomes, and in other words, the less frames per second you can render a game at. So in other words, rather than saying it being 60, they may have to cut that back to, let's, for example, say 30, or they may go on a variable frames per second. So in this video, we're going to be showing you one technique they can actually use to do this, and that is occlusion. Now, there are multiple different types of occlusion or hidden surface removal, and I'm going to be showing you a pretty simple one actually in this video. It's not going to be super in-depth, it's not going to be super complicated, but it will give you a very good understanding of what I'm talking about. So what is occlusion and what are the basic principles? Well, in this 3D world, you could see that we're in a very basic one. I'm going to show you guys a more complicated level in a moment, but just for now, this is a very simple one, and you could see that there's a cube in this, in this world. You can see that we've got a basic sky dome going on with the clouds moving, and everything's really pretty. Okay, so we're using Unreal Development Kit, so UDK, by the way, to show this off, which is free and all, so it's pretty cool. Now, in this, you could see that we do have indeed one cube, and if I was to, for example, move about in this world, we could see that the shadow does indeed follow a trajectory. So in other words, if we go this side, you can see there's no shadow. So in other words, it's self-shadowing because we've got the sun over there, so it makes sense that the shadow falls on the opposite side to what we're looking at now. So that would be, of course, right, behind here. Of course, you can't see it quite yet, but if I was to fly here, you can once again see it, and that lines up. Pretty simple stuff. Anyone, of course, who's looked at the sun in their life and, seen a shadow, they kind of understand that principle. But in reality, and this is the key thing, in reality, if you're not looking behind you, stuff still exists, right? In other words, an object doesn't disappear just because you are not looking at it. I know there's some philosophy and all that, but let's just, talk about basic practicality in this. So, the basic principle is that, look, if a player is not looking at an object, it does not need to be shown. In other words, if something is either in front of it, so in other words, obscuring the view, or you are not directly looking at that object, what is the point in the graphics card, the CPU, whatever else, rendering those details? Because, well, let's just be honest, it's wasting cycles. And so that's where the idea of occlusion comes in. The idea is that if something is out of your field of view, blocked by your blocked, so for example, let's say there's another object behind this one, and we'll show this in a lot more detail in a moment, then it doesn't need to be rendered. In effect, the world is just isn't shown at all. Now we'll show that off right now. So under the Unreal development kit. It's a very basic scene. It's one of the default ones. I'm just going to click on this, and you can see view culling / occlusion, which is a pretty good way. I'm going to be showing off a lot of this stuff in various game engines, by the way, including what texturing is and a lot more besides. It's one of the things I've been working on. I've been learning a lot about the stuff for you guys, including lighting and everything. So it's going to give you guys a really good understanding of what all GPU and game design is all about. So anyway, I'm going to click on view culling and occlusion, and right there you can somewhat see what the heck is going on, right? No, you can't, because we need to turn on real time. So let's turn on real time, and still nothing. So what the heck's actually happening? Well, it actually is because I'm still looking at this cube. You can see this other thing, which is actually my camera, right? So as you can see right now, everything in this view is mirrored in this view, because, well, I'm still looking at this object. So in other words, this is a camera showing you what is actually happening outside of this camera. You'll see exactly what I mean when I start turning and turning and turning. You see that? As the cube goes out of my field of view on the left hand side, it disappears on this. In other words, the game world is no longer rendering it. And so as we spin round, it's back into view. Now, that's a very simple way. I wanted to show a very simple cube to begin with, because when you're looking at this on a very complicated level and a complicated scale, it gets a hell of a lot easier, harder to understand. And we're going to go into a lot more of the technical details in just a moment. So I just want to give you guys a basic understanding of what this is. So in effect, if I'm not looking at it, occlusion just says, okay, well, it doesn't exist. And you can see what that is all about. Now I'm going to go ahead and load up a different level. Okay, so now we're in a lot more of a complicated world, and we can actually start seeing now what's actually really happening. And I'm going to start turning this, and you can actually see exactly what I mean. Right? You see that? I'm not looking at it, and so all the texturing, all of the main objects that make up this world quite literally disappear. So look at what happens, for example, to the water. You see that? It's very, very subtle, but it makes a huge difference in rendering times, because quite simply, the purpose here is because it's not being rendered, you have GPU cycles that aren't being taken up with, say, creating a polygon. I'm just going to move this to the side so you guys can get a better idea of what it looks like. I'm going to move it like that so you can get a kind of an understanding. Actually, I'm going to move it just a smidgen over. Don't worry about these boxes and stuff. These are all stuff that don't really matter for the purposes of this. And so if the game world doesn't need to render the objects, it's better it doesn't, because it saves GPU time. Now, there are a few issues with this, of course, and we're going to start talking about those right now. Now, one of them is it does increase the CPU overhead, and one of the purposes behind this is that the GPU is actually handles a lot of this stuff now, but obviously it does somewhat increase the GPU overhead and CPU overhead because, well, they have to decide what is being shown and what isn't. However, largely, it does much improve the performance of the games regardless, because obviously, once again, as I said, the fact of the matter is that games are becoming increasingly complicated, convoluted, and more difficult to render efficiently, and so there's no point in having like a ridiculous powerful system if the performance is just being wasted. You just get this situation where you're not really solving it for anyone. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to go outside and I'm just going to turn. And this is actually outside of the level. So we're just going to do exactly the same thing. And you can see exactly the same. So even the whole level as a whole just disappears, and it's pretty cool stuff in my personal opinion anyway. And so, of course, the most important thing for us to take away from all of this is that it's not just a case of, well, we need increasingly powerful components to be able to render stuff, render game worlds, be able to show off exactly levels of progression, but it's also very important for us to not to squander resources, because as I've said numerous times, resources on computing are not limitless. And it doesn't matter how powerful the next generation consoles are, it doesn't matter how powerful the graphics cards in your system are, as long as you're not running in very low resolutions, for example, on something like a GTX Titan, the bottom line is, if you put it on high enough resolution with enough anti-aliasing with a next generation game, you are going to start to max out the card, and therefore we do need a finite, or should I say, a way to maximize the finite power that we do have, and that's where these techniques do come in. So this has been a very basic video because I just want to show this off, because I've kind of alluded to it in a couple of videos before, mostly on the PS4 and Xbox One GPU video, which of course has been pretty damn popular on the channel, but I wanted to show off exactly what I was talking about on some of these efficiencies. So as I said, this has been one example. We're going to be doing a hell of a lot more work on this stuff over the next couple of months, so I can only hope you'll join me if you're interested in, well, geeky stuff. Anyway, that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you found it somewhat informative. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.